Hi, everyone, and thanks very much for joining us for our next session in Sustainability Week. For the next hour, we're going to be discussing, can bold policies save the world? No small feat to cover in the better part of 40 minutes, so we'll jump right in. We're joined by a very capable panel of handling that big topic in 40 minutes. First, I'd like to introduce Nicolas Makel, Chief Executive for Luxembourg for Finance, the agency that promotes the development of Luxembourg Financial Center. Remembering, of course, that Luxembourg's Financial Center is where more than half of the world's green bonds are listed. Simon Reddy joins us as well, the Director of International Environment for the Pew Charitable Trusts, where he directs the Trust's Protecting Coastal Wetlands and Coral Reefs project, along with the Preventing Ocean Plastics initiative, also no small feat. We're joined as well by Peter Mitchell, Environment Director at Japan Tobacco International, JTI, and Peter is a sustainability specialist with more than 20 years experience in integrating environmental strategies into business operations from the inside. And finally, we're joined by Andreas Fruschke, Head of Thematic Equity at Allianz Global Investors, where Andreas is responsible for research that focuses on global themes and specifically work they're doing to harness AI, open source analytics and data to manage climate risks and try to ferret out the opportunities that exist as well. So thank you all very much for joining us today. I'm Kaylin Birch from the Economist Intelligence Unit, and we'll jump right in if you don't mind. Now, obviously, we've got big targets set for 2050 for much of the European continent, and targets that then vary in countries around the world in terms of getting to a net zero emissions world. So we'll think, first of all, with the 2050 target in mind. Obviously, that's a big challenge, and it's going to require bold policies and kind of trailblazing thinking, much of which is probably already happening, but evidently we already still have kind of a long way to go to get to that point. So I'd like to start maybe, and I'll pose the first question to you, Nicolas, is what sort of bold action and policies do you think are necessary to get us to that 2050 goal? That could be something that you've already seen in practice, working in evidence, or perhaps a policy that is not in place yet, but you think is essential to get us over the hurdle to start making real progress. So Nicolas, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to speak at this event. Very important it is. I think that among the many things we are seeing already of action that helps to achieve the Paris goals, there are several. I'm going to stick to one. I think you will probably agree with me if I identify the European Commission's initiative stemming from its sustainable finance roadmap, in particular the taxonomy and the disclosure pieces of legislation. And that, in my opinion, will be a game changer for the financial industry. Why is that important? I think because it gives the financial industry the framework within which it can now become really active in order to deploy its role as a connector between investors and projects. If we want to achieve the Paris goals, not billions, but trillions of financing will be needed. And this framework that the European Commission has created will be helping to build the trust that the markets and the players need in order to invest in sustainable finance.
Is it essentially, do you think, a question of transparency, having effectively sort of a label for carbon friendliness or friendliness to the low carbon transition, generally speaking, that allows investors to then more effectively pick and choose where they want to be, that's aligned with their own climate strategy goals?
Absolutely. I think transparency is key in this, because what investors want to be certain of is that a product they're investing in is green. You were kind enough to mention the role that the Luxembourg Green Exchange is playing. I think the criteria and the processes they have set up in terms of making sure that green is actually green has gained them the credibility and the trust of market makers like the World Bank, like the EIB. So for us, it is really this trust and this transparency that leads to the trust that is absolutely fundamental in making sure that we can leverage the firepower of the financial industry in order to achieve the Paris goals.
And how far along the way to getting to that full transparency, if you will, do you think that we are, generally speaking, now? That might be a very unfair question too, but let's think specifically about Europe. How much progress do you think has been made, and how much further do we need to go before 2050? Are we on track?
That's a very important question. I think ultimately, if you look at the numbers, whether it is in capital markets or in the investment fund area, we are at the very beginning. We are in the lower single digits of market shares that are dedicated to actual ESG investments. We need to multiply every year this number. They are growing exponentially, but we're still at the very low end of what needs to be done. But I think this framework will help boost these numbers and will help increase the market share. Ultimately, the goal must be to mainstream sustainable finance. I think if everything we do in terms of financing becomes sustainable, then we will achieve these goals.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Maybe Simon, I'll move on next to you. Obviously, you're in a very different position looking at environmental protection specifically, slightly outside of the financial sphere, but obviously with big connections there. What sort of bold policies do you think are the most important to getting us there, and do they exist yet?
So, I mean, I was thinking back as to one, a bold policy that maybe has been successful, and two, one that gives me hope. So, in the first instance, one that was successful, I think, is probably the UK offshore wind industry. In early 2000, when I was working for Greenpeace, we produced a report called Offshore Wind Onshore Jobs, and it highlighted the potential for offshore wind in the UK, and also showed that if the government committed to 20% offshore wind by 2020, it could provide jobs and it could reduce carbon emissions. Obviously, we weren't the only organisation at the time that recognised this opportunity, but we're in a situation now in 2020 where the UK actually has 10% of its energy generation from offshore wind, and it is looking to produce 30% by 2030 and possibly even 50% by 2050. And the success of offshore wind is very much down to coordinated government policy. It's down to carbon budget commitments in the Climate Change Act, and it's down to technological development. And this is something that could be replicated in other countries, both onshore and offshore. The policies that give me hope are probably the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. This year, 2020, is the need, or it's a year when countries renew their commitments. But it's probably important to point out that NDCs are not only a commitment, but they also catalyse the necessary financial, technical and behavioural changes. We obviously need highly ambitious NDCs, as they're known, that will reduce emissions from key sources, but also other areas such as protecting habitats. Pew actually works on, as you mentioned, coastal wetlands and ocean plastic. And we'd like to see NDCs that both protect key habitats, that have the potential to absorb carbon and protect us from storm surge and rising sea levels. These would be habitats such as mangrove, seagrass and salt marsh. And Pew is actively working at the moment in the Seychelles, Belize and Costa Rica, helping these countries have these opportunities. Additionally, we'd like to see a movement away from single-use plastics. We just released a report called Breaking the Plastic Wave. And one of the key findings of this report is that if we curb the growth of plastic production and consumption and we implement system-wide changes, not only can we stop the amount of plastic going into the ocean, which is predicted to treble in the next 20 years, but under a business as usual scenario, but we can also offer significant opportunities to reduce carbon emissions from plastic production and also those resulting from mismanaged waste.
It's a really interesting point you bring up about kind of the, if you will, the struggle, or maybe the balance in a more positive sense, between cutting emissions and addressing the impact that's already been had on coastal environments and the environment writ large. So Where do you see that balance kind of fitting? Do you think that the second element you mentioned, so protecting the natural environment and trying to reduce some of the damage, whether that be plastic in the oceans or others that have already been built up, are those effectively built into the policies that are in place, do you think? Or is there still a big lobbying effort that needs to be made to make sure that they form as much of the effort as cutting emissions?
So, I mean, let's not get sidetracked. You know, the overall objective here is reducing emissions. We have to reduce emissions. The IPCC has clearly shown that. But there are other things that we can also be doing. You know, we know that coastal wetlands, especially mangroves, absorb 3 to 5 times more carbon than rainforests. So protecting these environments, and also in some cases looking at restoring these environments, is a crucial role that we can also be playing. The reality is that, you know, whatever we do, we are already on the track to climatic impacts. And so we need to look at multiple ways in which we can address this. Now, obviously, the elephant in the room is the emissions, but we also need to look at how we can build resilience into the system. And this is about protecting habitats. The other great sort of role that these habitats play is that they do protect communities from storm surge, and they will protect communities from certain levels of sea level rise associated with climate change. So, you know, we have multiple opportunities here. Yes, we need to reduce emissions, but yes, we need to build resilience into the system, and we need to protect the natural habitats that are going to help us in our fight against climate change.
And I presume there's an important community link there as well to making sure that we, you know, any of these efforts are inclusive, that if a habitat is maintained, it then supports the environment, human and natural around it.
Yes, I mean, the reality is some of the habitats we're talking about, they have multiple uses or multiple benefits. They're not just a climate issue, they're a biodiversity issue. They support incredible amounts of biodiversity, mangrove, seagrass and salt marsh. And in addition to that, they're important for cleaning water. They're a source of food for local communities. As I said, they would protect local communities from storm surge. So there are multiple benefits. And so it's a kind of win-win-win situation that we can make use of.
And I imagine one of the big issues here, and maybe I'll use this moment to pivot to you, Andreas, is matching up kind of the well-identified need for projects such as these and to match that with financing in an effective way. So, Andreas, I'll move to you now if you're open to it and see what sort of policies related to this or otherwise that are top of your agenda.
Well, Kate, and to your first point, where can finance help in this? Where do we play a role? First of all, there's reason for optimism. I think finance has already provided a step change in thinking in how we engage with companies and sort of the time frame that we assess and analyze companies on how they are prepared, not just for the next quarter, but actually for the next decades. And to the extent that you are already a shareholder in these companies, you can engage, you can encourage, you can support management a lot better to stick to these type of strategies that are not aiming to to benefit short-term incentives, but actually making sure that whatever you are focusing on short-term doesn't compromise the long-term goal. And ultimately, that's where the true valuation of any company rests. There's no disconnect for the financial industry to actually encourage companies to pay attention to these things that might not appear immediately imminent this year or next year, but to think about, you know, how resilient is your business model in 10 to 20 years. So we already are pretty much aligned, and we take this serious. And I would say we're taking this all combined more serious every year.
What would you say to Nicholas's first comments about kind of one of the groundbreaking strategies be to improve transparency and make sure companies have that as part of their annual reporting and are putting this information front and center? Do you agree that we're getting, you know, kind of in that direction? Do you think there's a lot more work that needs to be done? Where do you kind of assess progress we've made in that transparency initiative thus far?
Well, the transparency initiative certainly is going to make it a lot more easy for people to identify the companies who do have a long-term strategy, who are prepared for risks that already are on the horizon that might already be materializing. and those who are not. But it still takes someone to actually ask these questions and then to act on the results. It's not enough to just have that transparency and be able to incorporate that in your investment decision. You actually have to have, an alignment in your investors' thinking and expectations to actually move the portfolios in these directions. So we're seeing a lot more clients actually asking us for specifically these type of products, where we can provide transparency to the client and say, listen, you care about the environment, you care about these long-term issues, you care about putting your money to work where it can and will have an impact on people's lives. We can help you identify this, and the greater the transparency, the more easy it is for us to actually manage and achieve that.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the initiative you're working on using AI and open source data to try to, if I'm making assumptions here, but more accurately, quickly, and broadly assess risk and opportunities in this area?
Well, I think as we have more data available, we can obviously incorporate that data more profoundly in our investment processes. Historically, you would only have financial data to make up an opinion about what the future of a particular company might be looking like. Today, with this increase in transparency, there's a whole lot more to be said and to be challenged within a company structure that isn't immediately affecting financial returns, but maybe long-term resilience. And the more data there is, and the more capable you are in identifying that and structuring that, be it via the help of AI or just internal experts, you can put that a lot more effective into practice for ultimately those clients who feel their money shouldn't just be invested in anything that looks good on paper, but who actually expect and should expect in the future that their money is invested in alignment with their thinking, in alignment with their philosophy, in alignment with their beliefs, that something needs to happen, and it should therefore come as no surprise that these type of products that tackle that type of demand are going to be the ones that will see the future, and we should all look forward to that.
Great. I think that's again a good moment to switch to you, Peter, who are probably at the intersection of all of these issues within JTI, establishing a long-term environmental strategy, and from the inside of a business, meeting these new demands and kind of responding to your changing environment. What policies are at the top of your agenda?
Thanks, Kaylin. There's been a number of things that have been mentioned already. You mentioned the word intersection. There's been investment, collaboration, working together, and that for us is very important. We welcome, as most do in the private sector, bold, clear, consistent policies. And the ones that give me hope are really those that are inclusive. Those that are inclusive in terms of considering all relevant parties in the public sector and the private sector. But those that are also inclusive and acknowledge and address linkages between issues. Simon already mentioned the different sort of environmental topics that link together. Recently we've seen an increasing linkage and reference to connections between climate change and human rights. And that's an area where increasingly we're seeing governments, public sector and private sector work together. To come back to the point about investment, I think there's a couple of policies, programs that are worthy of mention. The first is how governments have worked together within the EU. And I'm not going to dwell on the EU because a lot's been talked about, and it's probably at the forefront of a lot of these programs and systems and schemes, as has been mentioned. But one I'd like to touch on is something called the joint crediting mechanism. One of the challenges for governments and countries to work together is that you've sometimes got a mismatch between countries that don't have sufficient resources to invest in innovation or energy transition or renewables. And then you've got countries that are willing to invest, but who within their own countries don't necessarily have the capacity to further expand the renewable capability or have pretty much exhausted opportunities for offsets. And through the joint crediting mechanism, it brings together, it pairs up countries. So, for example, the Japanese government has signed bilateral agreements with 17 other countries. And through that JCM, as it's called, our parent company, JT, is working in Thailand to install much more efficient biomass-based technology, which will reduce emissions. The idea then is that the credits, the benefits are shared between the countries involved and also the private sector players. And it stimulates investment and stimulates further development in these transition technologies.
It's an interesting point. I think we'll probably increasingly come up against that concern. Just thinking from my own experience in the United States, how many companies have a truly global kind of supply chain, production chain, and changing policies in one country may have a relatively light impact on their overall global impact through emissions or their various partners and suppliers and the like. So this kind of an idea to shift credit also down the line and knit governments and companies across borders up in this way is indeed very interesting. That raises another question for me, which I'll give to you, Peter, and I don't know if you're happy to comment on this, but I mean, one question that I've had on many occasions through the coronavirus pandemic is the issue of, in the midst of an abrupt, shocking, and evenly spread crisis, we haven't necessarily seen the same kind of level of government cooperation between countries or in kind of international platforms that maybe ideally would have liked to see. And some great examples of kind of countries leading on the forefront in the face of a crisis that affects everyone, but then some others, again, from my US experience, where there's not the same level of coordination. Is this something now thinking forward to the climate crisis? Do you think, you've mentioned one great example, but generally speaking, do you think we have a long way to go to try to knit up initiatives across governments and get a shared set of assumptions about the challenges? Is that one of the goals we're going to have to address between now and 2050, or are we already making progress?
No, I think that's a really good point, and it's a good question, a good set of questions, Kaylin. There's many learnings we can take from COVID pandemic, and you can translate those across to the climate crisis as well. No, there hasn't been a consistent approach, and there needs to be a much more consistent, coordinated approach. That's not just with governments. I mean, everybody has a part to play in addressing the pandemic: governments, businesses, and individuals. And there's, in terms of some key learnings from the pandemic, we know that governments can act at scale and pace and put forward the investment when it's needed. I think the challenge comes in the fact that just awareness of a risk, simple awareness of a risk, doesn't necessarily drive change. And you really only drive change or experience change, whether that be in government or business or with individuals, if that risk is perceived as real, important, and needs to be acted on quickly. And I think there's some other key learnings as well, which is about governments, business, communities working more closely together. So I think it has to be a collaborative approach. And as I said, many of those learnings from the COVID pandemic, we can translate into climate change. We need to act fast, and we need to act collectively.
Mm-hmm. And are you optimistic we have the basis for that collective work, or was 2020 a frightening example for you, writ large, maybe at a global scale?
I think it's a potentially frightening example, but I think, as I say, there's some key learnings, and it shows what can be achieved. We have to remain optimistic. If we don't have that optimism, we won't do anything, or we won't do enough. So I think we have to remain optimistic, but we have to, as I said, we have to act now, and we have to act at scale. And we've talked from the start of this session about bold policies. And those, it's going to have to be bold policy, but it's going to have to be bold policy that really drives an inclusive approach. It's going to have to be bold policy that it really gets governments working together. And it's got to be bold policy that drives investment in the innovation and the development of technologies and emissions reduction technologies. And to pick up on Simon's point, also those technologies that remove and take out carbon from the atmosphere. So carbon capture, utilization and storage technologies are going to be increasingly important.
Yeah. It's a good point you note there too, that we have to see bold policy across the way throughout the private sector. And it makes me wonder, and I'll open this question up to anyone who'd like to respond, but perhaps we can circle back around to you first, Nicholas, but just a financial, legislative, or tax-based environment is already in place to encourage those bold actions. And have you seen, for those who are at the forefront of taking bold action, especially in the private sector, have you seen already sort of an impact on business return, on kind of being able to lead in the sector? Do you think have we seen an impact yet, or is the framework not sufficiently supportive for taking those bold policies?
I think obviously you do see quite some strong action. I think, as Andreas has said before, you see investors really taking this very seriously. Why? Because the portfolio managers and the asset management firms that he, for instance, represent are becoming very serious about what companies they invest in on behalf of their clients. Whether it is Allianz or others, I think by becoming active on this and asking companies to really take it seriously, that provokes change. I give you another example, maybe not from the private sector, but the European Investment Bank, which is the world's largest lender, a balance sheet larger than the World Bank, has announced at the end of last year that by the end of 2020, all their lending activity will pursue the Paris goals, and by the end of 2021, they will have fossil fuel projects. That is decisions that are bold, decisions that really provoke change, and you have to think then that their balance sheet will go into other projects for which they will need to prove that the result is sustainable. The same, our government in Luxembourg, obviously on a much facing the first government to do so, to bind and tie itself to this framework when it issues debt, in order to make sure that the projects it finances or even refinances are targeting at sustainability. So I think there are plenty of examples where you now see really sustainability in action.
That's really interesting. Andreas, is there anything you'd like to comment on from that perspective as well? Or I have a follow-up, unless there's something you'd like to say on that.
Well, I'd agree to everything, that if you're in the business of long-term investing, it doesn't make a difference where you stand politically on this. Taking long-term investment decisions and taking long-term risks into account is the right thing to do. It's actually the only thing to do. And the more customers, the more clients, I think we can convince about taking the long-term view, the more change that is going to provoke, and the more empowerment this is going to shift to the owners of the corporations on behalf of the shareholders, to continue in our dialogues, to push forward and to encourage these type of strategies that are aligned with these long-term goals. So from that perspective, I think there's a lot of things to be said that make me quite optimistic, because directionally, we're certainly on track.
Great. And do you see a disconnect between short-termism in the political sector? That's not true of every country, obviously, but as a sort of a general concern, and long-termism maybe in the private sector. Again, to take the US as one example, elections every 4 years in an increasingly polarized environment, we can find ourselves making big swings from one side to the other in terms of our policy orientation every 4 years, which is a very difficult environment for companies and long-term investors to set and pursue those kind of goals. It may not be quite the same issue on the European continent or elsewhere, but is that a fundamental conflict that you see being part of the issue, and can the private sector play a specific role in driving more of a long-term view in the public sector and getting rid of that short-termism?
Well, not necessarily, because companies are used to that type of volatility, and you rarely bank your investment decision on who's going to win the next election, especially not if you're operating in a global context. There's always an election somewhere. And it's difficult to assume or think or be discouraged about the lack of progress maybe corporations or companies or us in general are making in the pursuit of these long-term climate goals. But I would encourage everyone to think back on where we started 10 or 20 years ago and where we are today. Certainly, the Paris Accord outcome was very different than the one in Copenhagen. And I mean, that are the milestones, I think, that will be remembered. And we should use these to judge the speed that we're traveling, and certainly the direction that we're traveling. Now, on short-termism, I mean, I would throw in maybe a slightly controversial point on that, because we're spending a lot of time thinking about what is the next big penicillin moment to address with some form of bold policy, a silver bullet solution to this. And that may never happen. And certainly the biggest pushback to all of these policies is either they're too expensive or that they don't really rank that high on people's priority list. And that shouldn't surprise us, because if you have more imminent issues that distract you, it's difficult for people to rally behind the idea that they should take action for something that is potentially decades away. We have tangible problems right now that also need solving, maybe more shorter term, but there's plenty of people who don't have access to clean water. There's plenty of people suffering from malnutrition who don't have access to basic healthcare services. In order to get more consensus and more prosperity into society to be able to afford these type of solutions, we should be tackling that. That might not be as long term, but it's certainly solving a lot of the more imminent threats that keep people distracted from focusing or allocating to that long-term solution that is needed. The more prosperity we can bring to the planet, the more people we can lift out of poverty, the more likely it is that people will be able to afford these solutions, will be able to send their children to get proper education, and then we can expect a lot more ideas to be on the table in 5 or 10 years, one of which might be offering a solution that we haven't even factored in our models because it isn't in the toolbox yet.
Good point about the interconnectedness of all the issues that we face, and addressing just one may not be enough, even if it's the most obvious one, emissions. It's not still the whole picture. Simon, did you want to come in on that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to sort of pick up on points that everyone's made, Nicholas, Andreas and Peter. I mean, Peter talked a little bit about risk, and at what point does the risk actually encourage us to take action? And then we talked about investment in climate change. I mean, I remember, I think it was 2006 that the Stern Review came out on the economics of climate change, saying that we needed to invest in order to, and invest, hundreds of billions of pounds in order to avert some of the impacts in climate change. And I think too often, coming back to Peter's point, we look at the risk, but we don't act quick enough. We don't sort of take a step forward. We get all these reports, we get all these studies. They're telling us we need to move forward, but we seem to be slow to react to that risk. And I mean, you can argue the same with coronavirus, is in that, a lot of people have been saying that there has been a significant threat for many years from a pandemic due to connectivity of our world in these days. But we don't seem to take the risk seriously until we get to a point where it does start impacting. And unfortunately, when it starts impacting, it's sometimes a little too late to avoid serious impacts and serious consequences. And I think that's the sort of lessons learned that we need to think about, is how do we overcome this risk versus sort of, what we do to tackle the risk. We don't seem to have dealt with this problem very well, I think.
I think, yeah, I'm sure you see some of the most obvious examples of that in terms of kind of looking at coastal environments, but particularly plastics in the ocean. And I actually, at this moment, would like to bring up one of the first questions we have from our audience sent in, which is, Simon, are you concerned or do you see a way out of the impact that the coronavirus crisis has had on the use of single-use plastics? We seem to be, the use of single-use had been seeming to die a death before the coronavirus, but it's resurged a bit this year, if I'm not mistaken. Are you concerned about what that means? Is that a step backwards in the efforts that's been made? And as a sort of a second part question, what do you think is the next most obvious step in policy or in legislation to try to combat plastics in the ocean?
I mean, obviously, look, coronavirus, the whole world is suffering from coronavirus. There's going to be an increase in single-use plastics. A lot of the PPE, which is important to us in combating coronavirus, is single-use. And so that's something I think that we have to accept. I mean, the way I look at this is that, coronavirus, we will tackle coronavirus. We will hopefully get through this pandemic. And we'll get to a situation where we're able to deal with it. And then we have to go back and relook at our use of, in terms of single-use plastic. Pew Charitable Trust, working with Systemic, just released a report looking at ocean plastics. And it shows that under the current trajectories, that by 2040, we will triple the amount of plastic going into the ocean from the current 11 million tons to over 29 million tons by 2040. And that current commitments by governments only make 7% difference to that trajectory. The positive side is that we can actually reduce that by 80% using current technologies. But it does mean that we have to reduce our use of plastics. We have to invest in other, invest better in recycling and reuse. We have to design plastics for a circular economy so that we are actually recycling and reusing plastics and they're designed for that purpose. And we have to have, better collection. And we also need to look for substitutes, and we also need innovation. We need all of these things, and it's a very complex issue. But I guess coming back to your key point, yes, we need to deal with coronavirus, but then, unless we want to face these consequences, we then need to turn our attention to single-use plastics and plastics in general.
I'll see a lot more about that. Peter, did you want to come in on that as well?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that. And again, Simon's made some very good points there. And plastics brings us back to some of the points we've already talked about how do we address this. And, it's got to be through a collaborative approach. It can't be done by a single action. It can't be done by one group, whether that be government or business or individuals. So there's got to be collaboration. There's also got to be strong policy, of course, but again, that has to be evidence-based and very clear and balanced. But that policy should also incentivize and not just, if you like, punish. And it should also encourage innovation and development, but also encourage education and also encourage, empowerment with individuals to do the right thing, to understand what they should be doing about plastic waste. So I think all of the actors in this have a role to play. And again, that brings us back to the analogies with climate change and with the other topics we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. I'm afraid that our time is growing to a close. I've got a few kind of summary thoughts I'll say at the moment, but I just wanted, does anybody else like to offer a final thought? I know I've certainly come away much more optimistic than I was prior, so thank you all for that. But anybody else like to jump in with a final thought? Nicholas.
Maybe one thought, if you allow, linking to what Simon and Peter have said, how we should link our lessons from Corona to the situation in climate change and also plastics in the ocean. I think what we really need to make sure is that when we dig ourselves out of this corona crisis, and especially with all the firepower put out there by not only governments, but also central banks and supranational authorities, take, for instance, the 750 billion of the European Recovery Fund, that needs to go into building back better, making sure that in the future we will prevent plastics from getting into the ocean. We will build an economy that is more sustainable in general, and thus also be put to good use in that sense.
I think build back better probably is exactly the phrase to end on. And I know you've all highlighted a lot of really important ways that we could concretely do that, having an incentive structure in place, linking up, as you noted, Andreas, public and private sector to have that strategic view that we already see developing, being played out already in the business sector. And Simon, also to make sure that we have coherent and comprehensive projects that address all of the elements that we see. And Peter, some of those elements you've already highlighted in those examples where companies are taking a comprehensive view to their supply chains, their partners around the world. So as I said, just terribly thrilled to come away with an even slightly more positive view than I did previously. So you've done us all some good. Thank you all again for joining us today. And I'll just remind our viewers as well, stay tuned for the next session where Clark Murphy from Russell Reynolds Associates will outline how we can prepare for the next generation of sustainability leaders. But thank you all again, Nicholas, Simon, Andreas, Peter, for this great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Helen.